Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today's presentation is about the discussion chapter and how to write it and the structure of this chapter. The presentation is a part of a playlist on master thesis and PhD dissertation. I hope you saw and watched previous relevant videos. But don't forget that the content of today is also relevant for people who are going to write articles. Now, the content of the presentation is mainly defining the purpose of the discussion chapter, what will be the structure of it, how to talk about the findings and recommendations, how to address the contribution, the strength and the limitation of the study in the manuscript, and how to discuss the implications on practice and future research before some takeaway messages. But allow me to have an introduction before starting so that you can position yourself when you are writing your manuscript. As you all know, that there's different 4 types of research. They can take us in different direction. Either we are doing socially useful research or not socially useful research, or we do research that advance science or research that does not advance science. In this famous quadrant here, the better you are on the upright side, where you are advancing science through your research and having a social impact or usefulness, the better your research is. But if you fall in any of the other quadrants, from a scientific point of view, you are not contributing to science. Imagine you are on the left low quadrant, then you will have a biased research, it is poorly designed and it's not validated, which means that it is socially not useful and at the same time not advancing science. So you need to avoid this quadrant totally. And also I strongly advise you to avoid the quadrant down to the right, which is only looking at advancing science without any social usefulness, which means that the research is very abstract without any application, and in this sense you are looking about theories or potential users or abstract ideas, and this is also not recommended. And most researchers fall in the top left, between the top left and the top right, when they try to do socially useful research, but it is not advancing science. And here we call it applied research, and the danger part of applied research that it is too commercial, looking at applications, not advancing science, and you need to make sure that you're distinguishing yourself unless your research is from the beginning designed to be useful socially without advancing science. However, when we are talking about a master thesis, or we are talking about a PhD dissertation, or we are talking about a scientific articles, in any case, those 3 types of manuscript, you need to make sure that you are in the top right quadrant where you are advancing science, and therefore in the discussion section it will be very important that you show how your work advanced science. Also, the discussion section is the place where you will exercise self-critique. You need to show that you can reflect on your work, and you need to present in this sense in the discussion section a degree of progress that was achieved, whether it is large or small or non-existent. You need to be honest. If you think there is no achievement, you can describe it in your discussion, along with the assessment of your used methodology for your research. Another important part that needs to be taken into account when we are talking about the discussion is the future. So the discussion need to give perspectives on the future. You need to provide realistic and thoughtful recommendation for further research in the area which is very important for your field. So these are some general tips before we start, but let's go to the essence of the discussion section and the structure that we need to respect. Well, as you all know, any manuscript, whether it's a master thesis or a PhD dissertation or a journal article, they need to have a structure. This is the very famous structure. We have a title, we have an abstract, we have authors, keywords, and so on, introduction, and so on. And as you can see, we have very classical conservative ways of structuring manuscripts. So manuscript plan instantly give a structure. They prevent you from forgetting to include any important point, and they prevent you from losing your way while you are writing. And in the scientific world, we don't have much we don't have much room to change the structure. The structure is very classical according to the IMRED structure. The IMRED structure requires to have an introduction, a methodology, results, and discussion. We might add up between the introduction and the methodology another chapter, we call it literature review, depending on your situation, but some people integrate the literature review in the introduction if it's a short literature review, if the topic is novel and there is not much written about it. But if you have sufficient publications or references about the topic, you will need to have this literature review section. And in our presentation of today, we are specifically focusing on the discussion chapter that will follow the results and that will be followed by a conclusion. And allow me to reiterate, we must have a conclusion chapter following the discussion. We cannot write discussion and conclusion. Discussion chapter is a separate chapter. So scientific communities have a tradition to package and shape information. In this way, we try to respect it. If you want to learn more about how to structure your article or your manuscript or your dissertation or your thesis, don't hesitate to watch the video about the foundations of scientific writing. Now, allow me to talk with you about something very important here, which is about storytelling. Storytelling and argumentation is the basis of scientific communication. So you will need to embed and practice storytelling in your developed manuscript or in article or thesis or dissertation. And you need to know that we have classically 6 chapters. Chapter 1 is the introduction. Chapter 2 is the literature review. Chapter 3, methods. Chapter 4, findings. Chapter 5, the discussion. And Chapter 6 is conclusion. And as you can see, it's not a surprise that Chapter 3, which is the methods, and Chapter 4, which is the findings, they are very scientific chapters, meaning that you are very objective, very factual, very systematic. You are not expressing your opinion. Because in the methods, you are describing what has been done and how it was done. And then in the results, you are reporting findings and main results of your work. So here you are very factual, very reserved, very measured while you are talking. But when we talk about the introduction chapter or the literature review chapter or the discussion chapter, the topic of today, we are talking here about communication. So this can be subjective. So your way of storytelling here can be subjective, looking at a creative way of convincing and argumentation and justification. And therefore, it's very important to take into account that the discussion chapter is an art of writing it. It's an art to write a good discussion chapter, and therefore it's important to have a good logic of storytelling. Also, a good manuscript must mix between the science and the communication. So, as I said, methods and result will be a dry chapter, very factual, very systematic. The discussion needs to be rich and showing your ability to discuss and to elaborate. And this will be the basis and the essence of your final presentation and your final defense when you are defending your work. Now, when we look at the structure of the discussion section, I am strongly recommending using this structure because it's one of the best structures that you can ever use. You need to start your discussion chapter with an introduction to remind the reader about the problem, about the aim of your research, remind the reader about the questions that were proposed in the introduction, and after this introduction, you can start to report regarding the findings, the recommendations, the contribution and the strengths of the work, the limitations of the work, the implications of the work on practice, and the future research. Those are the items that you need to report on. And in this presentation, I'm going with you step by step to address each of those items. Now, it's very important also to take into account that when you are going to address this section and when you are going to develop your paragraphs, you need to have a very well structured way. Always start your paragraph with an introducing sentence, then you can come up with an argument, you can support your argument with some sub-arguments if you need, and then you can also give an example, and finally you need to have a conclusion. So for every paragraph that is addressing an item of those items of the findings, recommendation, contribution, limitation, implication, future, you need to follow this logic. So I need to see at least a paragraph or two for each of those items, and this paragraph need to be structured with this logic of arguments, sub-arguments, examples, and conclusion. So this is important to take into account. But let's start with talking about the first part of your discussion section. After writing your introduction, you are now reporting on the findings and recommendations. I strongly recommend to title them together. So if your chapter is chapter 5, the discussion, 5.1 is findings and recommendations. Findings is what actually, and what I'm going to do. You can start by just writing some bullets. And here you have to ask yourself, what is the key message of my findings? What I want to convey from my work? Sorry to tell you, if you don't have a key message, if you finish your manuscript, whether it's a thesis or a dissertation or an article, and you don't have a key message in one sentence, what is here new? What do you bring through your work? Then your work is not going to be accepted. So make sure there is a key message you want to across here, and it can be a point of attack that you want to share with others. Then you can have sub findings or different cores of findings. Those can be some kind of punchlines or highlights. And you need also in the findings to articulate the essence of your research and avoid any acronym so that you aim at the general audience. So actually your findings need to be very factual, short sentences. Maybe start with the strongest finding, which is the key message, which is the punchline, and then you follow it with following findings. What is a key message? Key message should be reported in 2 points or in bullets. Report on the novelty of your work, report about the discovery of your work, what was your hypothesis. So it's very important when you're talking about your findings that you ask yourself, from a scientific point of view, what is new? What are the results that through my work I discovered that can advance science? And you report those new results. So you have always to report novel results of your research as well new methods. If you developed a new method, then you are reporting on a method. If you are developing new results thematically based on an analysis, you report on them. So include keywords of your research and concepts in your findings. Make sure that you include numbers and quantifiable findings, not just qualitative blah blah blah. They put numbers as much as you can, especially if you are doing quantitative research. Use simple terms and include key concept of your research. Focus on evidence and on the thematic article contribution, facts, number. In this study you found this. And in general, when you are talking about findings, try to have maximum 5 to 7 key findings. Now, writing the findings is not easy. It takes time. I advise you to watch a previous video on highlights. It will help you a lot to understand how to identify these findings and how to write them in the form of punchlines, bullets, attack lines. And you can start with having a pool of findings, maybe 10 or 11, 12, and then you start to eliminate them and reduce them to maximum 5 to 7, that they have to be well written, well listed, very strong, short sentences with number, quantifiable, talking about the findings of your results. So you need always to look in your result chapter to write your key finding. I'm not talking about findings because in the results we are writing all the findings of the work. But in the discussion section we are selecting key findings, 5 to 7 findings, and we are making sure that they are addressing the key concepts addressed in the research, the facts, the figures, and you make sure that they are very interesting with a key message at the beginning. So the importance of your findings starts top, the most important findings, till the least finding, and as you can see, don't exceed 7 findings in general. You want to have a very concrete example for how findings are written. I advise you to check this paper. It's in open access format. The title of the paper is called Impact of Climate Change on Nearly Zero Energy Dwelling in Temperate Climate, Time Integrated Discomfort, HVAC, Energy Performance, and Greenhouse Gas Emissions. This is just an example if you are interested to find an article applying my advices. Now, the second part, or let's say we are still in the first part, which is called Section 5.1. Section 5.1 should have a title called Findings and Recommendations. Now I finished talking about the findings. I'm going to talk about recommendations. Now, you need to know and to be aware before we start talking about the recommendations that the recommendation needs to be written for professionals. The findings need to be written for scientists, but the recommendations are for professionals. Let's say I am a medical doctor. I did a research. I'm reporting my findings for science. What did I find from a scientific point of view? But when I give recommendations, I'm going to give the recommendation for the doctor as a practitioner. What should be done? So findings and recommendations. Findings are scientific, recommendations are empirical or for professionals. And you need to make sure that not everything that is empirical is scientific, because empirical means based on practice, based on profession, based on experience. And science is pure objective. And in this sense, not everything we do in the professional life or in the practical life is scientific. So you need to be aware about distinguishing those two terms. When we say empirical, it doesn't mean evidence-based. Evidence-based is scientific, and empirical is experience and practice-based. So it's very important to be aware about this difference when you are writing your findings and when you are writing your recommendations. So let's start with the first advice here. Provide concrete and evidence-based recommendations and not based on experience. So when you are advising the practitioners and the professionals, tell them, please do that based on my findings, because my findings are scientific. And make sure that even in practice, if something is done, it can be done based on ancestries, learned lessons, based on experience. Science, in many situations, contradicts with empirical experiences. So make sure that when you write a recommendation, you are writing it from a scientific point of view. Address professional and authorities or decision makers. So in the recommendation, you are talking to a specific audience, either it's a professional or a policy maker or a decision maker. Link your recommendation to the findings and mention what should be done in practice based on what you discovered in the scientific realm, and for sure discuss the practical application of this suggested solution or the instrument. So in this recommendation, if you develop something, an instrument, a policy, a guide, a method, an approach, a tool, whatever you developed as an instrument, here you have to also discuss how it can be in practice used. So this is the first part that I wanted to share with you, the part of findings and recommendations. Now let's move to the second section of your discussion, which is, if we are in chapter 5, 5.1 was finding and recommendation, 5.2 should be contribution, comma, strengths and limitation, or limitations with S. Here we are talking about scientific aspects. What is the scientific contribution of your work? First thing you have to do when you are developing the contribution section or the paragraph, you need to ask yourself or place your result in the context. So compare your work to the literature and provide interpretation. And this is what we call it nesting. Nesting is exactly positioning yourself to others. So I came up in this research with a new method or with a new finding or a result of an analysis or an insight or a better understanding. So this insight or this understanding or this approach or this instrument I came up with, make sure that you position it, meaning that what did others do, what did you do, and compare your work to others. This is called the nesting, so that you say, okay, my work compared to other, is it a large progress, a small progress, no progress? You can report it in a very open way. Provide a synthesis of how results should be judged with citation, meaning that when you do this nesting and you are referring to others' work, you need to cite other works and you say, in comparison of the work of X, and you cite X, our work is slightly better, our work is significantly better, our work is remarkably better, our work is less relevant, and whatever the results you have. And this means that in the strengths or in the contribution strengths and limitations section, I need to see references, but very key references, maximum 5 important studies that are so close to what you did, and you start to compare yourself to them and, if possible, distinguish yourself to them. After that, you need to mention at least 3 to 5 strengths of your study. You can start by doing some bullets and make 5 strengths, discuss with peers or with authors or with your promoters, and then validate that those are really the strengths of my work. I always recommend to have 3 to 5 strengths points of your study. You can talk about your sample size, about the measurements that you did, about the methodology that you are used, about the uniqueness of the topic and how it is a new and novel topic. All these are different ways to articulate the strengths of your work. And you need also to talk about the strengths and the contribution that can be methodological, meaning that you have a new approach, a new technique, a new way, or it can be thematic, conceptual, Actually, you are talking about a very new topic that was not addressed before. So here it is thematic, it's conceptual, it's something that is not commonly addressed in literature, and you are in a very advanced topic or field. This could be here thematic, conceptual, or it can be empirical. Empirical meaning that you are talking about something related to experience and to practice, what is done in the professional world. So the uniqueness of your work, for example, is that you went down with practitioners and professionals, and you learned from their processes, and you went back to the scientific community to bring some learned lessons. So those are the three types of contributions. If you want to know more about it, there's a video I developed, it's called Novelty. You can have a look at the video to better articulate your strengths and limitations. But also in this section of strengths of limitation, you need to show to the reader how did you validate your work, how your work is reliable, how did you avoid bias, how did you assure quality in your work, what is the credibility of your work, what was the intention of your work, did you confirm your work, is your work can be generalized or it is local, it is subjective or objective, if you are doing qualitative or quantitative research. Can we transfer your work to other fields and domains, or can we not transfer it? So sometimes transferability could be considered as the strengths of your work, that others can transfer your work, apply it in other contexts. Sometimes the strengths of your work, that it is credible, because you did so much validation and calibration and testing and parameterization, and you compared model data with measured data, said that the credibility of work is so high, or you did so much experimental research. So experimentation, the credibility is very high. So you can use those four aspects as strengths of your work: transferability, or credibility, or confirmability. Confirmability if you are doing observational research or qualitative research, and you investigated so much, and you interviewed so many people, and you have a high saturation of your research. And in this sense, you can say my work is confirmable. Or you can say how the work is dependable. The dependability also can be a very strength point depending on your research. So use those four criteria if they are relevant to your research as part of your strengths. Also, it's very important here is to talk about the methodological validity in this section of strengths of limitation. When we talk about the methodologies, there's only 4 research methodologies that are used in the whole world. There is 3 quantitative methodologies and 1 qualitative methodology. The 3 quantitative are the modeling and the observational and the experimental research, and the qualitative is simply the different qualitative research methods. I have videos about each of those methodologies. Don't hesitate to check my channel. But let's start with the modeling research. If you do modeling research, you need to show that you validated your work through calibration, if possible, data quality assurance, and through sensitivity analysis and uncertainty analysis. This is the best way to do validation of this research approach, the modeling. If you're doing observational research, which is mainly statistical data collection on large scale, then the only way to show that your research methodology is validated is to show how you calculated the confidence interval. Confidence interval is the way to validate observational research. If you did experimental research, the only way to validate and show that your experimental research is relevant is to calculate the confidence interval. There is enough videos I developed about that if you need to learn more. And finally, if you are doing qualitative research, the only way to show that your qualitative research is valid is that you did triangulation. And there is a full video I developed about it. Don't hesitate to watch it. But by checking those 4 different techniques about validation, in your discussion section under strengths, contribution, strengths, and limitation, you will need to discuss how did you validate your research, and it could be a point of your strengths that you validated your research methodology, and you can articulate that explicitly in your research and iterate, talk about it. For sure, reproducibility is another aspect of strengths of your research. If your work is very written in a very transparent way, very systematic way, you have some protocols, you have systematic methods, description, then you can say, voila, my work is reproducible. I tabulated the data, I'm providing supporting information, I'm sharing the input, I'm sharing data sets, I'm reporting on the observational details, I'm providing the synthesis of the treatment in a transparent way. This could be also part of the validation, the reproducibility. My work is reproducible. So this allows my work to be strong, and this is one of the points of the strengths. So these are all ideas of arguments to include in your contribution, strengths, and limitation section. And last and not least, the validity and reliability in general needs to be always addressed by saying that you did a calibration or validation testing, you showed some error bars of your data, you repeated some experiments, you asked other labs to do the same test that you did in your lab to check how accurate is your results. You can conduct sensitivity checks, uncertainty checks like I mentioned before, and you can also conduct additional statistical tests if you are doing observational research. So these are all techniques to show that you are very rigorous in your validation. Now this last part of this section on contribution, strengths, and limitation is the limitation part. I wrote it in N, it can be in S, limitations, because in general we have different limitations. So first of all, you need to have a section or paragraph or two that is acknowledging the weakness and the limitations of your work. So would the result be occurred under different conditions? You need to answer this question. If somebody else did this result, would you have the same results? You need in general to mention 2 to 3 limitations of your study. Talking about the sample size, it was maybe here small, maybe the measurements were not accurate or there were no measurements, maybe the methodology is missing an item. You can talk about that very freely and consider it as a limitation. But make sure that your limitations are less than your strengths, because it's not logic to talk and put 5 limitations and then 2 strengths, then the paper will get rejected or your manuscript will be seen as a negative. At the end of the day, you need to have the balance and the confidence in yourself to say, yes, I did 3, 4, 5 good things in this work, but also I did 1 or 2 or 3 poor things in this work. And this should be always balanced. Despite those limitations, you need always to wrap up your limitation paragraph by being positive, that you say, despite those limitations that I mentioned, you need to make sure to state the degree of progress that was achieved of your work, because you don't need to be here perfectionist or torturing yourself. Regardless of whatever you did and regardless of the limitation, you need to trust in yourself and trust that your work is bringing a contribution. So you say, I have these weaknesses, 1 or 2 or 3 maximum, but in the same time, overall the work is valuable because it is progressing or advancing science in this area or shedding light on something we didn't know, providing an understanding, providing an insight, providing an analysis, providing a technique or a method. So it's important to be very balanced and position yourself in a not negative way. Now I am done with the 2 sections, the main 2 sections of your discussion. The first section was findings and recommendations. The second part was contribution, strengths, and limitation. Let's move to the implication on practice and future research. Now, as you can see here, we will have 2 parts. The implication on practice, this is a way and this is a part of your writing. This will be 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then future research will be 1 or 2 paragraphs. The implication on practice is not future research, so let me start with the implication on practice. Here we are talking about empirical work, experience, professional community, political. We are talking about what's happening in reality. So here we are touching reality. Here it's not very scientific. So here you need to discuss the implication of the research on the policy, on the current and future policy landscape, on the societal needs. You can talk and link what's happening today in the society. If there is a war, if there is a shortage, if there is a problem, economic, societal, political, whatever context, geopolitical context, socioeconomic context, you take this context and relate your work to this geopolitical and socioeconomic context. Very important in the implication of practice. And here effectively place your results in the national and regional political and socio-economical context and landscape, and make sure to discuss what your findings might mean for professionals. Here we are talking purely about professionals in your field of the study. What can they benefit from this work? And please Try to read while you are doing your manuscript, your thesis, or your article. You need to know what's happening in this domain, not only on the scientific level, but also on the empirical level, what's happening in the professional world. Many people in their final examination for the dissertation or for their master thesis, when the jury members ask them questions related to the industry, related to the society, related to the policy, they don't know anything. They're just scientific nerds who are focused on the scientific question and problem, but they don't know anything what's happening in the country they are studying around this problem from a societal, economical point of view. And this is shameful. You are not only intellectually advancing science in a high-level way, but you need to know what's happening in practice on ground. And this will only happen by reading professional newspapers. You need to know what is your profession, what is happening in practice. Is there demonstrations? Are there problems? What are the supply chain problems? What are the war problems? What are the economical problems? And in this section, you are developing 1 or 2 paragraphs where you are talking about the implications of your results in relation to the practice in the professional, in the real world. So it's very important to keep into account. However, the second part of this section, which is the scientific part, which is future research. When we say future research, this is written for scientists. So the future research is for a follow-up colleague. He or she will take your place, put themselves in your shoes, and they will do the directly next coming research that should be follow what you did. Here you need to talk about what should be done. You have to list the research actions that needs to be taken as a follow-up for your research. And if you were given one, you have to answer this question. This is a hypothetical question. Your writing has to answer this question. If you were given 1 year more to investigate further, what would you have done to build on the current study? This needs to be answered in future research. So it's very important to distinguish that from the implication on practice. And here also you need to talk about what is possible, what is probable, and what is preferable to be done in the future research. So here simply are talking about the next steps from a scientific point of view, what needs to be done. Extra measurements, extra surveys, more inquiries in this area, more studies in this field, more tests, more review in this question, parameterization. You need to study this variable or the influence of that on that. So here the future research section, it's written for scientists and it's written as a follow-up of what needs to be done. By that, I can say that this is the end of today's presentation. Some takeaway messages for writing your discussion section. Discussion chapter is very important because it shows your intellectual depths. It will show that you are not only a scientific person, but you are also professionally aware about what's happening in your field, and it's combining those two. I suggest to use this structure of having an introduction, then merging findings and recommendations under one section, then the contribution and strengths and limitation, second section, and then the implication on practice and future work under a third section for your discussion. And let's go with the advices. Start with your problem, aim, and research question, and make sure to answer them through your discussion. Convey a key message. You must have a punchline in your research findings, and it has to be start with in your finding. You have to nest your work in the strengths and the contribution and strengths section. You need to nest your work and place it in the context with others. What did others do? Avoid repeating the results or overplaying or downplaying the significance of your findings. Don't exaggerate with your findings. It's enough if you don't have big contribution. Make only 2 or 3 positive points and 1 or 2 negative points in the strengths and limitation. Also distinguish the message to the scientifics and word and the professional. Empirical is not scientific. So when I'm talking about findings, those are scientific. When I'm talking about recommendations, they are for the professionals. When I'm talking about implication on practice, I'm talking about the professional world and reality, policy, socioeconomics. If I'm talking about future research, I'm talking about science. So always you are doing yin-yang, back and forth between talking to scientists, talking to professionals, talking to the scientific community, talking to the research, talking about to the professional community. Those variations are part of the discussion section, and they have to go in a very smooth way in the middle strength, contribution strengths and limitation. This is on the scientific level, but the findings scientific, recommendations professional, and then implications professional, future work scientific. By that you can have a very strong discussion section, and if you elaborate enough this discussion chapter, I promise you that any question that will come during your defense or from your reviewers during the review process, you will be able to answer them, because then you will have a wider perspective and you have succeeded in expanding the result finding of your research and contextualizing in the society, whether the real world or in the scientific world. Well, thank you very much for today's presentation. Today's presentation is a part of a playlist on master's thesis and PhD dissertation. Don't hesitate to watch future videos, previous videos related to the field, and I wish you the best of luck of writing your discussion chapter, whether it's in an article, in a dissertation, or a thesis. Thank you very much for your attention. Today's presentation was about writing the discussion chapter. Good luck with your writing.